Michael Carter spent 11 years believing loyalty still meant something. He believed that if you stayed patient, stayed faithful, stayed useful when everyone else walked away, eventually the people you loved would see your value. But at 11:42 on a cold Thursday morning, only 48 hours after helping bury his wife's father, Michael sat alone in a glass conference room on the 43rd floor of a Manhattan law office while his wife slid divorce papers across a polished oak table without even looking him in the eyes. There was no shaking in her voice, no hesitation, just silence. The kind of silence that only comes when someone has already erased you from their future long before you realized it was happening. Michael looked down at the papers, then toward the rain sliding down the windows behind her. For a moment he said nothing, and that frightened Vanessa more than if he had screamed. 2 nights earlier, Michael had been sitting beside her dying father inside a private hospital suite overlooking Central Park. The old man's breathing was uneven, slow, mechanical. Machines pulsed softly in the darkness while doctors whispered outside the room. Michael had not left his bedside in nearly 16 hours. Meanwhile, Vanessa stood in the hallway wearing a dark green dress, texting someone with one hand while arguing with a financial advisor through an earpiece pressed against her hair. Nurses passed by pretending not to notice. The billionaire businessman everyone once feared was dying only a few feet away. Yet his own daughter seemed more concerned about paperwork than the sound of her father's voice fading from the world. Michael remembered watching her through the glass and realizing something painful. He was mourning a man who had treated him more like family than his own wife ever had. Before we go deeper into the story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. By the time the funeral ended, Manhattan's financial elite had already begun circling the Carter family empire like sharks sensing blood in dark water. Black SUVs lined the cemetery roads. Politicians arrived with security escorts. CEOs who once begged for meetings with Richard Carter now stood whispering beside marble statues pretending to grieve while secretly calculating what would happen to his billion-dollar company without him. Vanessa barely spoke to Michael the entire afternoon. During the reception, she laughed softly beside investors, accepted condolences with practiced elegance, and moved through the crowd like someone stepping into a future she had already imagined years ago. Michael stayed near the back of the room, shaking hands quietly, listening more than speaking. People overlooked him easily. They always had. To the outside world, he was simply the quiet husband who married into wealth. The invisible man standing beside the empire, never the one shaping it from the shadows. What nobody in that room understood was that Richard Carter trusted Michael with secrets he trusted nobody else to carry. For almost a decade, Michael had quietly handled some of the family's most delicate legal disasters behind closed doors. Lawsuits that could have destroyed the company vanished before reaching courtrooms. Federal investigations disappeared after carefully negotiated settlements. Rival executives attempting hostile takeovers somehow backed away at the last moment. Michael never took public credit for any of it. He preferred silence. Silence made people careless. Silence allowed him to observe what others missed. And over the years, he noticed something deeply unsettling about the Carter family. The richer they became, the less they valued loyalty. Every relationship became transactional. Every conversation had a hidden price attached to it. Even love inside that family felt negotiated rather than real. The night Richard Carter died, the old billionaire asked everyone to leave the hospital room except Michael. Vanessa protested at first, but her father ignored her completely. Witnesses later said the silence in that room lasted nearly 3 minutes before Richard finally spoke again. His voice was weak, rough, barely holding together. Yet every word landed with weight. He told Michael there was a difference between family and blood, and that most people spent their entire lives learning it too late. Then he reached toward the side drawer beside the hospital bed and handed Michael a sealed envelope with trembling hands. Michael stared at it without opening it. Richard told him not to let anyone see it. Not the lawyers. Not Vanessa. Nobody. Then the old man closed his eyes and whispered one final sentence that Michael would replay in his mind for years afterward. "When they finally show you who they are," he said quietly, "do not save them from themselves." 48 hours later, Vanessa walked into that Manhattan conference room with divorce papers already signed. Her attorney sat beside her, flipping calmly through folders worth more than most people earned in a year. Vanessa explained that the marriage had run its course. She said they wanted different things in life. She claimed the relationship had become emotionally exhausting. Michael listened without interrupting. But as she spoke, he slowly realized something disturbing. She had planned this long before her father died. The timing was too perfect. The paperwork was too prepared. Even the financial restructuring requests had already been submitted to the court before the funeral flowers had finished wilting. Michael finally looked up and asked only one question. "When exactly did you stop pretending?" Vanessa blinked for a moment, caught off guard by the calmness in his voice. Then she leaned back in her chair and gave an answer that would change everything. "The moment my father decided to trust you more than his own family." The divorce was never Michael Carter's biggest concern. That was the part nobody understood at the time. Not Vanessa. Not her attorneys. Not the executives waiting to carve apart Richard Carter's empire before the funeral flowers had even dried. They all believed Michael was sitting quietly in that Manhattan conference room because he was shocked, humiliated, broken by betrayal after 11 years of marriage. And maybe part of him was, maybe somewhere beneath the calm expression and steady breathing, there was still a man trying to understand how the woman he once loved could erase him so easily. But beneath that disappointment was something else entirely. Something colder. Something patient. Because while Vanessa believed she was ending a marriage, Michael already knew she was stepping directly into a trap she could no longer see. What made the situation unsettling was how calm Michael remained after receiving the divorce papers. Most men in his position would have argued. They would have demanded explanations, shouted accusations, threatened court battles, or begged for another chance. Michael did none of those things. He simply signed the acknowledgement form, folded the papers carefully, and placed them back inside the envelope as though he had expected every word. Vanessa noticed it immediately. Her attorney noticed it too. There was no confusion in his face. No panic, just acceptance. And that terrified Vanessa more than anger ever could. Because for the first time since she met him, she realized she could no longer tell what Michael was thinking. The quiet man she spent years underestimating suddenly looked like someone carrying information nobody else in the room possessed. By the following morning, rumors had already begun spreading through New York's financial circles. Some believed Vanessa had divorced Michael to protect the family fortune before Richard Carter's estate entered probate court. Others claimed Michael had secretly manipulated the dying billionaire during his final months to gain influence over the company. Cable news commentators speculated endlessly about the future of Carter Global Holdings, the real estate empire Richard spent 40 years building from nothing. Business blogs published leaked stories describing tension inside the family. Anonymous sources claimed Vanessa and her brother Daniel had fought bitterly with Richard during the final year of his life. But one question remained at the center of every conversation. Why had Richard Carter trusted Michael more than his own children? People close to the family struggled to answer it because the truth forced them to confront something uncomfortable. Richard did not trust loyalty spoken out loud. He trusted loyalty proven quietly over time. For years, Vanessa believed her father saw Michael as useful but replaceable. She thought Richard respected Michael's legal mind while still viewing him as an outsider who happened to marry into the family. But Vanessa misunderstood the kind of man her father truly was. Richard Carter had spent decades building an empire in rooms filled with liars wearing expensive suits. He understood human nature better than most people realized. He knew greed changed people. He knew power exposed character faster than hardship ever could. And during the final years of his life, Richard began noticing patterns inside his own family that deeply disturbed him. Business meetings became arguments about inheritance instead of growth. Private dinners turned into negotiations over trust funds and company shares. Even simple conversations carried tension beneath the surface. The more money the family accumulated, the more paranoid they became about losing it. Michael was the only person who never asked Richard for anything. That fact stayed with the old billionaire longer than anyone knew. While Vanessa demanded influence inside the company and Daniel pushed aggressively for executive control, Michael remained focused on protecting the empire itself. He worked late nights restructuring legal frameworks. He quietly prevented investigations from reaching the press. He handled settlements personally to avoid public scandal. When competitors attempted hostile acquisitions, Michael found ways to stop them before they reached boardrooms. Richard watched all of it carefully, and somewhere during those years something shifted inside him. He stopped seeing Michael as the man who married his daughter. He started seeing him as the only person strong enough to survive the family surrounding him. Still, none of that explained the sealed envelope Richard handed Michael hours before his death. Even now, people close to the case disagree about what exactly happened inside that hospital room. Nurses later testified that Richard specifically ordered everyone out before speaking privately with Michael for nearly 15 minutes. Vanessa claimed Michael manipulated her dying father emotionally during his final hours. Michael refused to discuss the conversation publicly. But according to sources connected to Carter Global Holdings, security footage from the hospital showed something strange after Michael exited the room that night. He stood alone in the hallway for almost 2 minutes without moving, staring down at the sealed envelope in his hands with an expression witnesses later described as deeply unsettled. Not triumphant, not emotional, just disturbed, as though Richard had revealed something Michael himself never expected to hear. The mystery surrounding Richard Carter's final will only deepen days later when reporters discovered that the billionaire's longtime estate attorneys had not yet received the finalized inheritance documents. That revelation sent shockwaves through financial markets. Investors panicked quietly behind closed doors while executives scrambled for answers. The media began speculating that multiple versions of the will might exist. Some insiders even claimed Richard changed the structure of his estate only months before his death. Vanessa publicly dismissed those rumors as nonsense, but privately she became increasingly desperate to locate whatever her father had hidden. Because somewhere beneath her confidence was a growing fear she could not fully control. She knew her father better than anyone, and Richard Carter was not the kind of man who left loose ends behind. What Vanessa still did not know was that 6 months before his death, Richard Carter had secretly made a decision that nobody in the family knew existed. A decision that would eventually destroy the illusion holding the Carter empire together. And by the time the truth finally surfaced, it would already be far too late to stop what had been set in motion. Long before private jets, billion-dollar contracts, and Manhattan boardrooms became part of his life, Michael Carter grew up in a one-bedroom apartment above a failing hardware store in Newark, New Jersey. The building smelled like dust in summer and leaking pipes during winter. His mother worked double shifts at a nursing home while his father repaired delivery trucks until a back injury forced him out of work permanently. There were nights when the electricity shut off without warning and mornings when Michael walked to school pretending not to notice classmates staring at the worn sleeves on his jacket. But hardship shaped him differently than people expected. It did not make him loud or angry. It made him observant. Quiet children often notice things other people miss, and Michael learned early that the world revealed itself more honestly when you listened instead of spoke. While other boys chased attention, Michael stayed buried in books borrowed from public libraries, fascinated by contracts, courtroom arguments, and the invisible systems controlling powerful people from behind polished office doors. Teachers noticed his mind before anyone else did. By 16, Michael was winning statewide academic competitions against students from schools far wealthier than his own. He earned scholarships that eventually carried him into Columbia Law School, where professors described him as unusually disciplined, almost unsettlingly focused for someone his age. While classmates networked at rooftop parties and expensive dinners, Michael spent nights alone in the law library reading corporate litigation cases until sunrise. Security guards often found him asleep beside stacks of legal textbooks with handwritten notes covering entire notebooks in impossibly small handwriting. He never chased popularity, never tried to impress people, and somehow that made him stand out even more. Michael was the kind of man people ignored until they needed him. The kind of person who entered rooms quietly and left carrying solutions nobody else could find. Years later, executives would privately admit that Michael Carter could solve problems entire legal departments failed to understand. But during those early years, nobody saw a future billionaire strategist. They saw a scholarship student from Newark who spoke softly and dressed modestly. The first time Vanessa Carter met Michael was during a charity gala hosted at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Michael attended only because one of his professors forced him to represent the university's legal fellowship program. He hated events like that, rooms full of wealthy strangers pretending not to compete with one another exhausted him. Vanessa noticed him almost immediately because he seemed completely untouched by the atmosphere around him. While men twice his age chased her attention with rehearsed confidence, Michael stood alone near the back of the room studying an old marble sculpture as though he genuinely preferred it over conversation. Vanessa approached him partly out of curiosity and partly because she was tired of people trying so hard to impress her. Their first conversation lasted nearly an hour. Michael spoke carefully, thoughtfully, never once asking who her father was or what her family owned. That alone made him different from almost every man Vanessa had ever met. For the first time in years, Vanessa felt seen as a person instead of an opportunity. Michael listened without interrupting. He remembered details. He asked questions nobody else asked. There was a calmness about him that made the chaos surrounding her life feel quieter. Their relationship moved quickly after that. Private dinners turned into weekends together. Weekends became vacations, and before long, Michael found himself entering a world built on unimaginable wealth and influence. To outsiders, their relationship looked like a modern fairy tale. The billionaire's daughter falling for the intelligent young attorney from a working-class background. Newspapers praised the romance. Business magazines called Michael refreshingly grounded. Richard Carter himself appeared impressed by Michael's composure during those early years. But admiration and respect are not the same thing. And somewhere beneath the expensive dinners, luxury penthouses, and public smiles, cracks had already begun forming long before either of them admitted it. Vanessa loved the way Michael made her feel emotionally safe, but over time she also began resenting the qualities that once attracted her to him. His quietness started feeling distant rather than calming. His refusal to chase status embarrassed her in rooms where image mattered more than honesty. Michael never cared about luxury the way the Carter family did. He could sit inside a $12 million penthouse and still seem more interested in reading legal reports than admiring the skyline outside. Vanessa slowly interpreted that detachment as weakness. She wanted ambition she could display publicly. Power people could immediately recognize. Michael's strength existed privately, hidden beneath patience and restraint, and that made it invisible to people obsessed with appearances. Their marriage did not collapse suddenly. It faded gradually through thousands of small moments neither of them fully addressed. Missed conversations, quiet disappointments, long silences stretching across dinner tables inside homes too large to feel warm anymore. Inside the Carter family itself, Michael never truly belonged. Richard Carter respected him, but the rest of the family treated him more like a highly useful employee than a son-in-law. Vanessa's younger brother Daniel openly mocked Michael's working-class background during private gatherings. Extended relatives joked about how lucky he had been to marry into the family. At business events, executives often assumed Michael was part of the legal staff rather than a member of the family itself. Michael rarely responded to the disrespect. He understood something most people never learned. Wealthy families often confuse arrogance with strength because nobody around them dares challenge the illusion. Instead of arguing, Michael focused on work. And quietly, almost invisibly, he became essential to the survival of Carter Global Holdings. What nobody outside the inner circle realized was how many disasters Michael prevented behind closed doors. 3 years into the marriage, federal tax investigators nearly opened a criminal inquiry into one of Richard Carter's overseas subsidiaries. Michael resolved the issue before it reached the media. 2 years later, a former executive filed a fraud lawsuit that threatened to expose damaging financial practices inside the company. Michael dismantled the case piece by piece until it disappeared entirely from public attention. Then came the attempted corporate sabotage from a rival development firm in Chicago. Millions of dollars vanished through manipulated contracts before anyone noticed the breach. Michael traced the entire operation himself and stopped the takeover less than 48 hours before the board lost voting control of the company. Richard Carter never forgot those moments. Because each time the empire stood near collapse, it was Michael. Not Vanessa, not Daniel, not the expensive consultants, who quietly kept everything standing. And that was exactly what frightened Richard Carter during the final years of his life. He began realizing that the person protecting the empire was also the person the family respected the least. The imbalance disturbed him more than he admitted publicly. He watched his children grow increasingly entitled while Michael remained disciplined, careful, and loyal even when loyalty brought him little in return. Richard understood power better than anyone around him. He knew empires rarely collapsed from outside attacks. Most are destroyed from within by people too blinded by greed to recognize the individuals holding everything together. 6 months before his death, Richard invited Michael to a private meeting inside his Connecticut estate. No assistants attended. No attorneys were present. Even Vanessa never learned the conversation took place. Hours later, Richard contacted his estate planners and ordered a series of confidential changes to his final will. Changes so severe that once they became public, the Carter family would never recover from them. And years later, investigators would point to that secret meeting as the exact moment the future of the Carter empire changed forever. Richard Carter's final night alive felt strangely quiet for a man whose name once controlled boardrooms across half the country. Outside the hospital windows, Manhattan glowed beneath cold sheets of rain, while traffic lights reflected against wet streets 40 floors below. Inside the private intensive care suite, machines hummed steadily beside his bed, measuring the final hours of a life built on power, ambition, and control. Nurses moved carefully through the room speaking in lowered voices, aware that some of the most influential people in New York were gathered just beyond those glass doors waiting for updates. But inside the room itself, there were only 2 people Richard truly wanted near him. One was Michael Carter. The other never arrived. Vanessa spent most of that night pacing the hallway with her phone pressed against her ear, arguing quietly with financial advisors and executives already discussing the future of Carter Global Holdings before Richard had even taken his final breath. Michael noticed everything without saying much. He noticed how Vanessa never once held her father's hand during those final hours. He noticed Daniel disappearing repeatedly into empty corridors to take private calls with investors. He noticed attorneys arriving near midnight carrying folders nobody bothered hiding from the nursing staff anymore. The atmosphere surrounding Richard's death no longer felt emotional. It felt transactional, like people were waiting for a door to unlock rather than mourning the man dying behind it. Around 2 in the morning, Richard suddenly motioned weakly for everyone except Michael to leave the room. Vanessa looked irritated more than concerned. Daniel rolled his eyes before walking out without protest. Once the door closed, silence settled heavily between the 2 men. Richard stared toward the skyline outside for several moments before finally speaking in a voice so weak Michael had to lean closer just to hear him. "You were the only loyal person in this family." Michael lowered his eyes immediately, uncomfortable hearing those words spoken aloud. For years he had avoided becoming emotionally involved in the tensions inside the Carter family. He told himself his responsibility was protecting the company, protecting the structure Richard spent decades building. But deep down, he knew the old man was right. Loyalty inside that family existed only when money benefited from it. Richard coughed painfully before continuing. He admitted he had spent the last few years watching his children transform into strangers obsessed with inheritance rather than responsibility. He said wealth had given them comfort without discipline, influence without character. Then Richard reached slowly toward the drawer beside his hospital bed and removed a sealed envelope with trembling hands. Michael stared at it carefully but did not touch it immediately. Something about Richard's expression unsettled him. The old billionaire no longer looked powerful. He looked tired, like a man finally accepting truths he spent years avoiding. "The final version of the will," Richard whispered slowly, struggling for breath, "is not with the attorney." Michael looked up sharply, confused for the first time all night. Richard's longtime estate lawyers handled every major financial structure inside Carter Global Holdings. It made no sense for the finalized inheritance documents to exist outside official legal channels. But before Michael could ask another question, Richard gripped his wrist weakly and spoke again. "When everything starts falling apart, do not trust appearances. Promise me that." Michael nodded quietly, though he still did not fully understand what Richard meant. Minutes later, doctors rushed back into the room after alarms began sounding from the monitors beside the bed. Nurses pushed Michael aside as medical staff flooded the suite, trying desperately to stabilize Richard's condition. Vanessa finally entered the room during the chaos, but by then it was already too late. At 3:17 a.m., Richard Carter was pronounced dead. Witnesses later described Vanessa's reaction as strangely restrained. Daniel looked stunned for only a few seconds before immediately asking hospital administrators about media access restrictions. But Michael remained standing near the back wall, holding the sealed envelope tightly in his hand, staring silently at the floor while the empire surrounding him began shifting beneath everyone's feet. The funeral 3 days later felt more like a corporate transition ceremony than a goodbye. Black luxury vehicles stretched across multiple city blocks outside St. Bartholomew's Cathedral, while reporters crowded behind barricades hoping to capture reactions from the Carter family. Political figures arrived with security teams. Billionaires exchanged quiet conversations beneath cathedral ceilings while television anchors described Richard Carter as one of the last great American business titans. Vanessa moved gracefully through the crowd dressed in black, accepting condolences with controlled elegance. Daniel spent most of the service whispering with investment partners near the front pews. Michael stood several rows behind them almost completely alone. People acknowledged him politely when necessary, but few made genuine effort to include him in conversations anymore. To the Carter family, Michael had already become invisible. What hurt most was not the public distance. It was the realization that Vanessa no longer even pretended to hide it. During the reception following the burial, she introduced Michael to one investor simply as Richard's legal advisor. Not husband, not family, just another professional attached to the company. Michael noticed the hesitation in the investor's face immediately after the introduction, the awkward realization that something inside the marriage had shifted. Later that afternoon, Michael overheard Daniel openly discussing inheritance projections near the bar, while guests were still offering condolences nearby. Daniel spoke casually about board restructuring, executive voting rights, and liquid asset transfers as though his father's death were merely another business acquisition waiting to finalize. Michael said nothing. He spent most of the evening standing near the windows watching rain collect against the glass while conversations around him grew colder and more calculating with every passing hour. 48 hours after the funeral, Vanessa finally made her move. That evening, Michael returned to the penthouse overlooking Central Park, expecting another tense silence stretched across expensive rooms that no longer felt like home. Instead, he found Patricia Sloan sitting beside Vanessa inside the living room. Sloan was one of Manhattan's most feared divorce attorneys, famous for dismantling high-profile marriages involving enormous wealth. The moment Michael saw her leather briefcase resting beside the coffee table, he understood exactly what was happening. Vanessa invited him to sit down with a calmness that felt rehearsed. Patricia opened several folders neatly organized with financial disclosures, property agreements, and prearranged settlement terms already prepared weeks in advance. Michael realized immediately this had been planned long before Richard died. Vanessa crossed her legs slowly and looked at him with the same detached expression she used during board meetings. "You'll receive generous compensation if you cooperate quietly," she said. "The attorneys believe this arrangement protects everyone from unnecessary public attention." Michael stared at the documents for several seconds without touching them. There it was again. That same unsettling calmness Vanessa noticed during the earlier meeting downtown. No anger, no pleading, no shock, just silence. Patricia Sloane studied him carefully, clearly expecting resistance that never came. Michael finally picked up the papers, scanned a few pages, then set them gently back onto the table. "That's it?" he asked quietly. Vanessa looked confused by the question. "What exactly were you expecting?" Michael almost answered, almost told her how long he had watched the family drift toward this exact moment. But instead he simply nodded once and stood up slowly. Vanessa interpreted the silence as defeat. She believed the man standing before her was emotionally exhausted after years of being tolerated rather than loved. What she failed to understand was that Michael's silence no longer came from pain. Came from certainty. After Patricia Sloane gathered the documents and Vanessa prepared to leave for the evening, Michael remained alone inside the penthouse for several minutes without moving. Rain tapped softly against the windows while distant traffic echoed below the building. Then, slowly, he walked toward the study Richard Carter once used during private family meetings. Hidden behind a framed painting near the bookshelf was a biometric safe very few people inside the family even knew existed. Michael placed his hand against the scanner and waited while the mechanism unlocked with a quiet metallic click. Inside sat 3 items: a second sealed will, a stack of confidential company ownership files, and a collection of audio recordings labeled with Richard Carter's handwriting. Michael stared at them silently for a long moment. Then, for the first time since Richard's death, he smiled. 3 days after Vanessa handed Michael the divorce papers, the Carter family gathered inside the executive conference chamber at Carter Global Holdings for the official reading of Richard Carter's will. The room itself reflected the kind of wealth most people only see in movies. 40-foot windows overlooked Midtown Manhattan, while polished walnut walls displayed photographs documenting Richard's rise from a struggling real estate broker to one of the most powerful developers in America. But beneath the expensive architecture and carefully controlled appearances, tension moved through the room like electricity. Vanessa sat near the head of the conference table wearing a black suit with diamond earrings her father once gave her on her 30th birthday. Daniel leaned back beside her, pretending confidence he clearly did not feel. Senior executives whispered quietly near the windows while attorneys organized thick folders across the table. Michael arrived last. He carried no briefcase, no notes, no visible emotion. He simply took a seat near the far end of the room and waited. The lead estate attorney, Harold Whitmore, began reading the official inheritance documents shortly after noon. First, everything appeared routine. Richard's properties, investment holdings, and charitable foundations were outlined exactly as expected. Vanessa would retain partial residential assets. Daniel would receive limited operational oversight inside specific divisions of Carter Global Holdings. Several longtime executives would receive financial bonuses for years of service. The room slowly relaxed. Vanessa even allowed herself a faint smile as though the future she imagined was finally beginning to stabilize. But then Whitmore stopped speaking mid-sentence. Witnesses later described the shift in his expression as immediate and unmistakable. Confusion first, then concern. Finally, something close to panic. He removed his glasses slowly and looked toward another attorney seated beside him before quietly asking whether a particular amendment file had already been disclosed to the family. The room fell silent. Vanessa frowned immediately. What amendment? Whitmore hesitated before answering. It appears Mr. Carter submitted a revised controlling structure approximately 6 months ago. Daniel leaned forward sharply. That's impossible. We reviewed the finalized estate summary last year. Whitmore swallowed hard before continuing. This amendment supersedes significant portions of the original inheritance structure. Vanessa's face hardened. Then read it. What happened next permanently changed the Carter family forever. Whitmore explained that the official will currently sitting before them had already been rendered legally incomplete due to a confidential secondary amendment Richard Carter filed privately months before his death. The revised documents introduced a conditional governance structure tied directly to behavioral compliance among designated heirs. Nobody in the room understood what that meant at first. Then Whitmore read the clause aloud. Control of Carter Global Holdings would not automatically transfer through bloodline inheritance. Instead, operational authority would remain under a protected trust overseen by an appointed executor until all heirs satisfied specific ethical and fiduciary conditions established personally by Richard Carter himself. Vanessa stared at the attorney in disbelief. Who is the executor? Whitmore looked down at the file again before answering quietly. Michael Carter. The silence afterward felt suffocating. Several executives exchanged stunned glances while Daniel stood up so quickly his chair nearly crashed backward onto the floor. Vanessa slowly turned toward Michael for the first time since the meeting began, but Michael remained completely still. No reaction crossed his face. No satisfaction. No surprise. Just silence. Because unlike everyone else in that room, Michael already knew what the amendment contained. What nobody else understood yet was that Richard Carter had not simply rewritten his will. He had rebuilt the entire corporate foundation of the company around conditions only Michael fully understood. Years earlier, Richard secretly instructed Michael to restructure portions of Carter Global Holdings after several internal scandals nearly exposed dangerous weaknesses inside the company. Michael redesigned the ownership protections personally, embedding legal safeguards so complex that even senior board members barely understood them. At the time, everyone assumed the changes were standard corporate protections against hostile takeovers and shareholder interference. In reality, Michael had quietly created something far more powerful. The company's governing trust now operated through layered loyalty clauses, ethics provisions, and marital conduct requirements tied directly to executive inheritance eligibility. Richard believed wealth destroyed people when consequences disappeared, so he built consequences directly into the empire itself. Vanessa unknowingly violated those conditions weeks before Richard died. The divorce filing triggered one breach. Private financial transfers Daniel authorized through offshore accounts triggered another. And hidden communications between Vanessa and outside investors revealed discussions about removing Michael from company oversight before Richard's death had even occurred. The deeper the attorneys examined the amendment structure, the worse the situation became for the Carter family. Under the revised trust conditions, both Vanessa and Daniel temporarily lost executive inheritance authority, pending a formal ethics review controlled entirely by the appointed executor, Michael. For the first time in years, Vanessa looked genuinely frightened. The story exploded across financial media before the meeting even ended. Anonymous leaks from inside Carter Global Holdings spread through newsrooms within hours. Cable networks interrupted programming to discuss the unprecedented inheritance battle unfolding inside one of America's largest real estate empires. Headlines questioned whether Richard Carter intentionally disinherited his own children. Business analysts debated the legality of behavioral inheritance structures tied to corporate governance. Social media erupted with competing theories about Michael Carter. Some portrayed him as a manipulative strategist who secretly positioned himself to seize control of the company. Others argued he was a loyal insider protecting Richard's final wishes against greedy heirs. But one question dominated every network, podcast, and financial publication in the country. Who really owned Carter Global Holdings? Outside the company headquarters, reporters gathered around the clock, waiting for statements, while stock prices fluctuated violently throughout the week. Investors panicked quietly behind closed doors. Competing firms attempted to exploit uncertainty surrounding the company's future. And somewhere beneath the media chaos, investigators began uncovering details far more disturbing than a disputed inheritance battle. Because Richard Carter had been documenting his family privately for years, the audio recordings Michael discovered inside the biometric safe became the center of everything. At first, Michael listened to them alone inside Richard's private study late at night, while rain struck the penthouse windows outside. Some recordings were harmless conversations about company strategy. Others revealed something far darker. Richard secretly recorded multiple meetings after becoming convinced members of his own family were hiding financial activity from him. In one recording, Daniel discussed moving company funds through overseas accounts connected to shell corporations in the Cayman Islands. Another captured Vanessa speaking privately with outside investors about restructuring company leadership once her father's health deteriorated further. The timing of those conversations deeply unsettled Michael because many occurred while Richard was still alive and actively fighting for his health inside the hospital. But investigators soon discovered something even worse. Digital forensic teams reviewing company records uncovered evidence that Daniel had quietly embezzled millions of dollars from Carter Global subsidiaries over a 4-year period. The money moved through layered consulting firms and fake development projects hidden beneath legitimate transactions. Richard suspected financial misconduct before his death but never identified the full scope of the theft. Michael did. Then the security footage surfaced. Hospital surveillance records revealed Vanessa meeting privately with Patricia Sloan nearly 2 weeks before Richard Carter died. The footage showed them entering a private consultation room carrying estate documents and divorce preparation materials. Timestamp analysis later confirmed portions of Vanessa's divorce filing were already drafted before Richard even entered critical condition. Public reaction turned brutal overnight. News commentators accused Vanessa of planning her exit strategy while her father was dying. Online speculation exploded. Former employees began leaking stories describing years of tension inside the family. Anonymous executives claimed Richard privately feared his children would destroy the company after his death. And that was the moment Vanessa realized she had made a catastrophic mistake. Because until then, she believed Michael would protect the family the same way he always had. Quietly, privately, without exposing anyone publicly. But something changed after Richard's death. For the first time in 11 years, Michael stopped shielding people from the consequences of their own actions. And once the investigations gained momentum, there was no longer any way to control what surfaced next. By the time the Carter inheritance case reached federal probate court, it had already become one of the most discussed corporate scandals in America. News vans crowded the streets outside the courthouse before sunrise. Protesters gathered behind barricades holding signs accusing the Carter family of greed and corruption. Financial analysts filled television panels every night debating whether Carter Global Holdings would survive the internal collapse unfolding in public view. But inside the courtroom itself, the atmosphere felt strangely restrained. No shouting, no dramatic outbursts, just tension hanging heavily beneath every whispered conversation and every shifting glance between attorneys. Vanessa arrived wearing dark sunglasses despite the storm clouds outside. Daniel looked exhausted after days of questioning by forensic accountants. Patricia Sloan still projected confidence publicly, but people close to the case later admitted she already understood the situation was becoming impossible to control. Michael Carter entered the courtroom alone. No security detail, no press statement, no visible emotion. He sat quietly beside his attorneys reviewing documents while cameras flashed around him from every direction. Reporters described him as unervingly calm, almost detached from the chaos consuming the Carter family around him. But Michael was not detached. He was simply prepared. For weeks, he had reviewed every financial record Richard Carter left behind. Every hidden agreement, every recorded conversation, every transfer routed through offshore accounts. And the more evidence surfaced, the more Michael realized Richard had spent years anticipating exactly this outcome. The old billionaire knew his family would eventually turn against one another after his death. He simply underestimated how quickly it would happen. The turning point came midway through the third day of hearings. Patricia Sloan attempted to challenge the legitimacy of Richard's amended inheritance structure by arguing the billionaire had been mentally compromised during his final months. It was a calculated move designed to weaken Michael's authority over the trust while restoring Vanessa's inheritance claims. For several hours, the argument appeared effective. Even some media commentators began speculating that the court might suspend Michael's executor powers pending psychiatric review of Richard's mental state before death. Vanessa finally looked hopeful again for the first time in days. Then Michael's lead attorney requested permission to introduce previously undisclosed evidence. The courtroom fell silent as a small digital recorder was placed onto the evidence table. Vanessa frowned immediately. Michael said nothing. The judge approved the request, and seconds later, Richard Carter's voice echoed through the courtroom speakers for the first time since his death. The recording quality was rough, but unmistakable. "If my children betray the people who protected this family," Richard said slowly, "they deserve nothing." Nobody moved. Even the reporters sitting near the back of the courtroom stopped typing. Richard continued speaking through the recording, explaining how he spent years watching greed consume the people closest to him. He described discovering secret financial manipulation inside his own company. He admitted privately fearing that the empire he built would eventually collapse under the weight of entitlement and betrayal after his death. Then came the sentence that completely shattered Vanessa's remaining confidence. "Michael never asked me for power," Richard said. "That is exactly why he deserves it." Vanessa stared toward the defense table in visible shock while Patricia Sloan slowly closed her legal folder without speaking. Daniel lowered his head into his hands. Across financial media, clips from the courtroom spread within minutes. By evening, every major network in the country was replaying Richard Carter's final recorded statement, while analysts debated its devastating implications for the family. Public opinion shifted almost instantly. Michael no longer looked like an opportunist manipulating a grieving billionaire. He looked like the only person Richard ever trusted to protect the company from the people inheriting it. And the truth was even more painful than the public realized. Michael never wanted the money. Friends close to him later admitted he had privately considered leaving Carter Global Holdings years earlier after repeated humiliation from Vanessa's family. He stayed because Richard convinced him the company still mattered beyond wealth itself. Tens of thousands of employees depended on the empire remaining stable. Entire neighborhoods across the country existed because of Carter development projects. Michael believed abandoning the company during vulnerable years would punish innocent people more than the family itself. Richard understood that sacrifice deeply. More importantly, he recognized something none of his children ever understood. Michael valued responsibility more than ownership. Power should belong to the person who never chased it. That line from Richard's recording became the defining headline of the entire case. Vanessa's reputation collapsed almost overnight. Social media turned vicious. Former friends distanced themselves publicly, while leaked private messages painted her as emotionally calculating long before Richard's death. Investors froze multiple Carter family accounts pending fraud investigations. Luxury properties connected to Daniel's offshore transactions became subject to federal review. Corporate sponsors quietly withdrew from charity foundations Vanessa once controlled. Everywhere she turned, cameras followed. Reporters shouted questions outside restaurants, airports, and apartment buildings. For years, Vanessa lived inside a world where wealth insulated her from consequences. Suddenly, that protection vanished all at once. Witnesses inside the courtroom later described the exact moment she emotionally broke. It happened after forensic accountants presented evidence linking Daniel to millions of dollars hidden through shell corporations tied directly to Carter Global subsidiaries. Vanessa initially tried defending her brother publicly, insisting he misunderstood the transactions. Then prosecutors introduced internal emails revealing Daniel knowingly manipulated development contracts while using family influence to avoid scrutiny. Worse still, several communications showed Vanessa privately aware of irregularities months before Richard's death. She never reported them. She protected Daniel instead. Vanessa began crying quietly at the defense table while cameras captured every second. Michael never looked at her. That silence hurt more than public humiliation ever could. Then came the final legal strike. Michael authorized investigators to release the full financial audit Richard secretly commissioned before his death. The report exposed hidden fraud across multiple Carter subsidiaries, including offshore theft, falsified development expenses, manipulated accounting structures, and unauthorized asset transfers linked directly to Daniel. Federal authorities moved quickly after the findings became public. 2 days later, Daniel Carter was arrested outside his Manhattan apartment by federal agents on charges involving wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and financial conspiracy. News helicopters filmed the entire scene from above, while stunned neighbors watched agents escort him into an unmarked vehicle wearing handcuffs. Within hours, Patricia Sloan formally withdrew from representing Vanessa. Her public statement claimed irreconcilable legal complications made continued representation impossible. But insiders close to the case later revealed Patricia discovered portions of Vanessa's divorce strategy may have overlapped with efforts to shield assets already under investigation. She realized staying connected to the Carter family could destroy her own career. So she walked away before the collapse became complete. For the first time since Richard Carter died, Michael finally stood completely alone at the center of the empire. The courts supported him. The trust belonged to him. The company answered to him. And yet, despite everything he uncovered, Michael still felt something deeply unsettled beneath the surface of the case. Because hidden inside Richard's private files was one final sealed document Michael had not yet opened. A document Richard specifically instructed him to read only after the investigations ended. But the biggest secret had still not been revealed. Not even to Michael himself. 2 weeks after Daniel Carter's arrest, the media frenzy surrounding Carter Global Holdings finally began slowing down. News channels moved on to newer scandals. Protesters disappeared from outside the courthouse. Financial markets stabilized after Michael quietly reassured investors that the company would continue operating normally under temporary trust supervision. But inside the Carter penthouse overlooking Manhattan, silence settled over the rooms like dust after a fire. For the first time in years, the apartment no longer felt alive. Vanessa had moved into a private residence downtown after most of her personal accounts were frozen during the investigations. Daniel remained in federal custody awaiting trial. The family empire Richard Carter spent 4 decades building now stood balanced entirely on the shoulders of the one man they spent years underestimating. Yet despite finally possessing everything the family once fought to protect, Michael felt no victory, only exhaustion. 3 nights after the court hearings officially concluded, Michael returned alone to Richard Carter's private study. Rain tapped softly against the windows overlooking the city, while distant traffic lights flickered below through the darkness. The room still smelled faintly of Richard's cigars and old leather-bound books. On the desk sat the final sealed envelope Richard instructed him not to open until the investigations ended. Michael stared at it for several moments before finally breaking the seal carefully with his thumb. Inside was a handwritten letter spanning nearly 20 pages. The first line immediately unsettled him. "If you are reading this, Michael, then I was right about all of them." Michael sat down slowly as thunder rolled somewhere beyond the skyline outside. Richard's handwriting grew weaker across later pages, but the message itself remained painfully clear. The old billionaire admitted he had known for years that his health was deteriorating faster than doctors publicly acknowledged. He confessed that much of the inheritance structure was designed not only to protect the company, but to expose the true character of the people surrounding him after his death. Richard explained that wealth had blinded his children to the value of loyalty, patience, and sacrifice. But then the tone of the letter changed completely. "There is one truth I hid from you your entire life," Richard wrote, "and you deserve to know it now." Michael's eyes narrowed as he continued reading. More than 30 years earlier, before Carter Global Holdings became a billion-dollar empire, Richard Carter came dangerously close to financial ruin after a disastrous development project collapsed in Chicago. Banks withdrew support. Investors abandoned him. Lawsuits piled up faster than he could contain them. According to the letter, Richard privately considered ending his own life during that period because he believed everything he built was already lost. Then one night, an independent mechanic named Samuel Carter, Michael's father, offered him help when nobody else would. Michael stopped breathing for a moment. Richard explained that Samuel once owned a small trucking company contracted to transport construction materials for one of Richard's failing projects. When bankruptcy threatened to destroy the operation, Samuel secretly mortgaged nearly everything he owned to help Richard keep the development alive long enough to secure emergency financing. Samuel never asked for recognition, never demanded repayment. In fact, Richard admitted Michael's father specifically refused written contracts because he believed helping people mattered more than profit. The risk nearly destroyed Samuel financially. Within 2 years, health complications and debt consumed most of what remained of his business. Michael was still too young to understand why his family struggled so severely afterward. Richard spent decades trying to repay that debt quietly. Suddenly, everything made sense. The scholarships, the mentorship, the opportunities Richard placed in Michael's path. Even the first charity gala where Vanessa met him. None of it happened by accident. Richard had been watching Michael for years before they ever officially met. Not out of pity, but out of obligation. Gratitude, respect for a man who sacrificed everything expecting nothing in return. But somewhere along the way, Richard realized something else entirely. Michael possessed the same qualities his father once did. Integrity without performance, loyalty without reward, strength without arrogance. And that terrified Richard because he knew those qualities no longer existed anywhere else inside his family. Michael lowered the letter slowly into his lap while emotion tightened across his face for the first time since Richard's death. All those years spent believing he built his life entirely alone suddenly felt different. The old man never viewed him as an outsider marrying into wealth. Richard viewed him as the son of the man who saved his life long before billions of dollars ever existed. And in Richard's mind, protecting Michael was never generosity. It was repayment for a debt he believed he could never fully settle. 3 days later, Vanessa contacted Michael privately requesting one final meeting. No attorneys, no reporters, no cameras. They met inside the empty Connecticut estate Richard once used for private family retreats. The mansion felt colder than Michael remembered. Most of the staff had already been dismissed, and several rooms sat covered beneath white sheets awaiting liquidation proceedings. Vanessa stood alone near the windows overlooking the lake when Michael entered. For a few seconds, neither spoke. She looked thinner now, tired, like someone carrying the weight of consequences she never imagined becoming real. Finally, she turned toward him. "Did you plan all this?" she asked quietly. Michael looked at her for a long moment before answering. "No," he said calmly. "I just stopped protecting people who never loved me." Vanessa lowered her eyes immediately, not because the words were cruel, but because deep down she knew they were true. For years, Michael defended the family from scandals they never even noticed. He absorbed disrespect without retaliation. He stayed loyal to people who slowly erased him from their lives piece by piece while still depending on him whenever crisis appeared. Vanessa once believed Michael's silence meant weakness because she never understood the difference between quietness and restraint. Now, standing inside the ruins of everything her father built, she finally understood too late. She asked Michael if he hated her. Michael thought about the question carefully. Then he shook his head. "Hate requires emotion," he replied softly. "I think I'm just tired." That answer broke whatever remained inside her. Vanessa began crying quietly near the windows while rain rolled across the lake outside exactly the way it had the night Richard died. Michael said nothing else. There was nothing left to say anymore. Some relationships do not end with screaming or revenge. Sometimes they end with silence so complete that both people finally understand how far apart they became long before the ending arrived. Weeks later, Michael stood alone inside Richard Carter's old office overlooking Manhattan one final time before transferring executive authority to a long-term management board approved by the trust. He never intended to keep permanent control of Carter Global Holdings. That was never the point. The empire survived. Thousands of employees kept their jobs. The corruption hidden beneath the company finally surfaced. In Michael's mind, that was enough. As he walked through the empty penthouse for the last time, the city lights reflected softly against rain-covered windows while distant thunder echoed above New York. The rooms that once hosted politicians, billionaires, and family celebrations now sat completely silent. No cameras remained outside. No reporters waited downstairs. Just emptiness. And somewhere within that silence existed the final truth Richard Carter spent years trying to understand before his death. In the end, the Carter Empire was not destroyed by greed alone. It was destroyed by the inability to recognize loyalty before it disappeared. And maybe that is the tragedy hidden inside so many powerful families. They spend their entire lives chasing people who look impressive while overlooking the ones quietly holding everything together behind them. So now the question becomes unavoidable. If you were Michael, would you have forgiven them? Stories like the one you just heard stay with us because they force us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature. Richard Carter spent his entire life building an empire worth billions of dollars, believing he could secure his family's future through wealth, influence, and opportunity. Yet in the end, none of those things protected the people he loved from their own choices. What ultimately determined the future of his empire was not money, status, or inheritance. It was character, the very thing most people overlook until it is too late. Michael Carter never set out to become the most powerful person inside Carter Global Holdings. He never chased ownership. He never fought for control. In fact, the one thing that separated him from everyone else was his willingness to carry responsibility without demanding recognition in return. And perhaps that is why Richard trusted him when nobody else could be trusted. Looking back on everything that happened, it becomes clear that the collapse of the Carter family did not begin when Richard died. It did not begin when Vanessa filed for divorce. It did not even begin when Daniel started hiding money through offshore accounts. The collapse started years earlier, in small moments nobody considered important at the time. Moments when loyalty was ignored. Moments when gratitude was replaced by entitlement. Moments when the people holding everything together were treated as though they could never walk away. By the time Richard realized what was happening, the damage had already spread through every corner of the family. All he could do was leave behind a system designed to reveal the truth after he was gone. Perhaps the most heartbreaking part of this story is that nobody truly won. Vanessa lost her family, her reputation, and the future she thought was guaranteed. Daniel lost his freedom. Richard died knowing his children were becoming people he barely recognized. Even Michael, despite ending up with the authority everyone else fought over, walked away carrying scars that wealth could never heal. Sometimes justice arrives exactly the way we believe it should, yet still leaves sadness behind. Because justice and happiness are not always the same thing. Stories like this remind us that betrayal rarely comes from strangers. It comes from the people who believe you'll never leave. The people who assume your loyalty has no limits. The people who mistake patience for weakness and kindness for dependence. And when those assumptions finally collapse, the consequences can change lives forever. Now we want to hear from you. Do you think Vanessa deserved what happened? Or do you believe Michael went too far when he stopped protecting the family from the consequences of their actions? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because this is one of those stories where reasonable people often see things very differently. And if you thought this family secret was shocking, wait until you hear the story of the billionaire who attended his own funeral and listened as his family fought over an inheritance they were never supposed to receive. If you enjoyed this story, make sure you subscribe for more true-style dramatic stories inspired by power, betrayal, loyalty, family secrets, and hidden revenge. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.